Whoa, almost fell. Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. If you're watching these videos, they are intended for use by students who are enrolled in my class. If you're in someone else's class, they may go over different structures. You may have different structures on your list of things to know, maybe different models. So if you find this helpful, great. Watch the videos, hit like, hit subscribe if you want to get more videos as I load them, and you can be on my YouTube channel. If nothing else, please hit like. We're going to be going over, and for our class, we're going to be on page 33 of our list of things to know. We're going to start the female anatomy. So, this model shows you the female anatomy, and just like the male models, if you watch the video on the male anatomy, we're going to have 3 or 4 different models. There are some additional models that we're going to go over in another video that show some other structures that, that you need to know for the female anatomy. So now, this is a female cut in a mid-sagittal section. Here's a little bit of the leg. And one of the first things you can see, this is the pubic bone, and this is the muscular wall of the abdomen, the abdominal muscles. This little bump or fat pad that sits right on the pubic bone is called the mons pubis, M-O-N-S, mons pubis, which means pubic mound. But it's a fat pad. And it turns out that the only animals that have a mons pubis are those that have face-to-face intercourse. And not a lot of animals do that, but dolphins and human beings do. Now, there's a structure that is called the, I'm drawing a blank, the vulva, V-U-L-V-A. The vulva is the external female anatomy. So what we mean by that is this. You can see this tube coming in here. This is the urethra, and this is the urinary bladder. This tube is the vagina leading to the uterus and all the internal anatomy. From those openings, all of this outward stuff is referred to as the vulva. Now the vulva consists of several structures. One of them is this outer fold here of flesh, which is called the labia majora. The labia majora. Now when the labia majora are separated, there's an inner set of skin folds called the labia minora. This would be the labia minora. Okay. They're part of the vestibule. And then you'll see the urethral os, or the opening of the urethra, and the vaginal os, or the opening of the vagina. They're not on the list. Okay? So females actually have 3 openings. Males only have 2. Males have the urethra and the anus. Females have the urethra, the vagina, and then the anal opening. The skin, by the way, that is between the vagina and the anus is called the perineum. Okay? So this is called the perineum. Now, one of the things that can happen in females is if fecal material from going to the restroom gets wiped in the forward direction, then bacteria, fecal bacteria can get in here and they can get into the urethra, causing infections, and they can get into the vagina, causing infections. The number one cause of bladder infections in females is fecal material, fecal bacteria getting into the urethra. So it's important that females, you know, they used to teach that when you're cleaning a female as a patient, you wipe the front to the front and the back to the back. Now I think it's just all they teach you, wipe everything front to back. Okay. Anyway, so the clitoris sits here and it's anchored to the pubic bone just like the penis is, and it has erectile tissue just like the penis. When a female gets aroused, blood flow into the clitoris becomes increased and the clitoris becomes enlarged. It actually has a little pouch of skin that surrounds it. Some people call it the hood of the clitoris, but it's really called the prepuce, just like it is on a male. Okay? And when the female clitoris is enlarged, it will extend out of the prepuce, increasing the likelihood that it gets stimulated. That can be important because stimulation of the clitoris is how a majority of women reach orgasm. Some females can reach orgasm simply through vaginal stimulation, but it's a very small percentage. Some through clitoral stimulation only, and some through either or. It's important for females to know their physiology so that you can share that with your partner when you become intimate. Whether we like to talk about it or admit it or not, sex is a way of communication between individuals. We see it when we study chimpanzees. A healthy sexual relationship with your partner is really important. And, you know, you guys, all of y'all know, guys are all, when things get exciting. So it's important for you to drop clues or hints or just be open and frank with your partner. And it will lead to a more satisfying sex life, which can lead to a more satisfying relationship. It's one of many complex parts to our relationships in life. So it's important to know some of that. All right, so that's the vulva or the external genitalia. Sorry, I lost the lights there because I didn't move. So labia majora, labia minora. At the very beginning, at the very end, the labia minora come together and then open up again for the prepuce, and there's the clitoris and mons pubis. We have the urethra and urinary bladder. This is the vagina or vaginal tube. And then this entire organ here, which arches forward, is the uterus. The uterus has several layers to it. This little light outer covering right here is called the perimetrium. Metrium refers to uterus, and peri means around. The thick muscular wall here is called the myometrium, and there's a thin edge here. It's kind of hard to see on this model, so we'll usually test on a different model. But that's called the endometrium. And then we have the uterine cavity here. Now the uterus sits on top of a tube, and that tube is the vagina. And the part of the uterus right here where the number 6s are that extends into the vagina is called the cervix, which means the neck of the uterus. The uterus is actually very narrow. If I could look at it from the front, and then it extends out like a big, it's almost like a pear shape. So that would be the cervix. And that's where cervical cancer occurs and needs to be detected. Now, the uterus has a front part, which is, when you get a pelvic exam, one of the things they'll do is press real hard above the pubic bone, and they're trying to feel what's called the fundus of the uterus, which is this front part. Okay, right here would be a fallopian tube or uterine tube. They cut it off, but here's that same fallopian tube on the other side. Our book uses the term uterine tube, but you'll also hear it called the fallopian tube. And when females have a tubal ligation, to ligate means to tie, that they get their tubes tied or cut. That's the tube here. The fallopian tube ends up in these little finger-like extensions called fimbriae, and then they sit right very close to the ovary there. So that's the ovary. These are the fimbriae. This is the fallopian or uterine tube. This ligament that extends from the ovary to the uterus is called the ovarian ligament. And then this one coming off the front here, going to the front, is the round ligament. And there's some other ligaments that we're not going to name. So on this model, you should be able to see these things. Mons pubis, the clitoris with the prepuce, labia majora and labia minora, the urethra with the urinary bladder, the vagina, the cervix of the uterus, and the uterus is the entire organ, and the fundus of the uterus, the front part. We have a perimetrium, a myometrium, and the endometrium, and the uterine cavity. We have the round ligament, the ovarian ligament leading to the ovary, and then the fallopian tube with the fimbriae. Okay? I think that's everything that I can show you from this model. Now, we have the exact same stuff, but a little bit more three-dimensional on this model. So let me get it set up. Let me make sure it's in the view of my camera. And let me zoom in on it. So I apologize for all the movement. Please don't get dizzy. And hang with me a little bit. All right, so this model shows us a lot of the same stuff. The only difference is we haven't completely cut the uterus and the bladder in a full mid-sagittal section. Here's the mons pubis. Here is the labia majora, the labia minora. You can see the clitoris there. Here's the urinary bladder. Here you see the uterus, and you can see the vagina, this muscular tube here. And then there would be a fallopian tube or uterine tube. Again, on this side, they cut it. If I tilt it a little bit, you should be able to see what's called the round ligament, the fallopian or uterine tube, the ovary back here with the fimbriae, and the ovarian ligament. There's also a ligament that comes off the sacrum called the uterosacral ligament. We're not going to worry about that. And then here's a ureter coming down, going past all this to the bladder. There would be a ureter there. Now, one of the things that you do see on this model is this. This enlarged mass right here that sits in the outer wall of the labia minora is a gland that also gets enlarged when a female becomes aroused and starts to lubricate the vagina. And that gland is called the vestibular gland or the greater vestibular gland. Okay, that's the greater vestibular gland and the wall of the labia. Again, I can break this open like the last model that we looked at, and then it would look just like the other model, only better color. So mons pubis, labia majora, labia minora, clitoris, the urethra and the urinary bladder, the vagina. There's the cervix of the uterus. There's this whole thing is the uterus. This outer covering right here would be the perimetrium. You can see the myometrium here, the thick musculature to squeeze the baby out. And then this darker red layer would be the endometrium. That's where it engorges with blood and breaks off and is lost every month in a menstrual cycle. And then this would be the uterine cavity, the space inside. Okay. This is the perineum, and then you can see the anus. Again, we already went over all that. It just gives you a little bit better view of everything and how everything is sort of oriented. Here's the colon, here's the coccyx and the sacrum. You can see a ureter coming down from the urinary bladder. So it's lots of good anatomy. Finally, we have this model. And again, let me make sure this is in our field of view. Yeah, it's good. So now, this model sits on the stand, and this is it's not set up right. Someone actually put it on here incorrectly. Now, this is what it should look like from an anterior view. The labia majora and minora would be here. This is the fundus of the uterus, the front part. You can see the two fallopian tubes here. One goes this way, forming the fimbriae around the ovary, and the other one goes here. And then this would be the rectum. Okay? If I flip the model around posteriorly, you just see the rectum here, and then you see the fimbriae on the fallopian tubes. One of our pictures somewhere is labeled incorrectly. They call this the vagina. That's not the vagina. Okay. So now, if I take the model off the stand and I tilt it back, then you can see the labia majora, you can see the anus and the perineum and the vaginal opening, and the labia minora would be right inside there. Okay. We could break it open, and it's going to be exactly like the last model, so I'm not going to do that. But it does give you a pretty good three-dimensional analysis or awareness of how all the structures fit together and how close and intimately they are connected to each other. Okay. Anyway, that's going to conclude all the female anatomy models for the uterus, the vagina, and all the related structures, with the exception of one other model. Okay. Which means that does not conclude this part. I forgot. We have these flat uterus models. And let me make sure that they are within our frame so that we can see them. I have two of them here. And this is as if we took the vaginal... Oops, sorry. But these videos are getting long and I'm getting tired, so I'm not going to reshoot it. So, this is as if we took the vaginal canal and the uterus, and we flattened them out so that they're running straight in line instead of folded. This is the vagina. These are spermatozoa. The spermatozoa should be microscopic. They are not that size, okay? But for illustrative purposes, they made them full size so you can see the head and the flagellum. But they would still be microscopic. So this is the vagina. You can see the musculature of the vagina. This would be the cervix. There's a narrow area of the uterus called the isthmus, and the isthmus is narrowing. Don't worry about it. This would be the body. This top part is the fundus of the uterus. You can see very clearly here the perimetrium, the myometrium, and the endometrium. This would be the uterine or fallopian tube. Here's an oocyte. It's not pronounced oocyte, it's pronounced oocyte. And the spermatozoa looking for it. There's a bend in the fallopian tube or uterine tube, which is called the infundibulum, and then we have the fimbriae. Okay, and the fimbriae can actually be separated from an ovary. They're not physically attached to it; they're just sitting on it, brushing it. This would be the ovarian ligament and the suspensory ligament. It's the only model where we can see the suspensory ligament on the model, and it doesn't actually go to here. It actually would go behind this and onto the other wall. So, one of the things you also see is that the endometrium actually extends deep into the fallopian tube, And if it starts to come out and grow on the outside, that's called endometriosis. Or endometriosis can be an enlarging of the endometrium in the fallopian tube, and it gets very swollen and irritated and very uncomfortable for females that have endometriosis. In severe cases, it can actually come out and start to grow on the outside here and needs to be surgically addressed. Now, I'm going to slide this over. This is the exact same one. The only difference is now the egg was fertilized, it went through all the development, and it is implanting into the endometrium. The blood of the endometrium is rich with nutrients and ions and all the stuff to support life, because that little structure right there, that little ball of cells that's developing that we call the embryo, does not have the ability to get food. It doesn't have a mouth and a digestive tract and a circulatory system yet. It's just a little ball of developing cells that have not differentiated. So they absorb all the nutrients from the blood of the endometrium. If the egg is not fertilized, or even if it's fertilized too late and cannot implant in time, all the nutrients of the endometrium will leach out into the uterus, and it becomes very nutrient poor. So we have to break it off, and it is lost in menstruation every month, and then we rebuild a new nutrient-rich and oxygen-rich endometrium. So that's the female menstrual cycle. And you can see an implanted embryo here, and you can see what's called the mucus plug. So we'll talk about some of that in lecture. But that model shows you a good view of the ovarian ligament, the ovary, the suspensory ligament, a great view of the fimbriae and the fallopian or uterine tube, perimetrium, myometrium, endometrium, the cervix, and the vagina. Anyway, that concludes our pictures and anatomy of the female. So we're going to do some more models, but they're not of the uterus and the vagina. Thanks for watching. Please study this stuff like you can't stand it, like your grade depends on it, because it does. Have a good day. Hope you had as much fun as I did.